Hello. When I was 16, I had the good fortune of spending my junior year in high school in an all-boys lycée in Paris. On my first day, I realized I was hopelessly ill-equipped to understand any of the incomprehensible cacophony. Fortunately, sitting next to me was a French boy who had just transferred to the school and didn't know anyone either. He spent the next few weeks charitably tutoring me in indispensable French obscenities. Olivier and I became fast friends. He introduced me to his extensive family, his 3 elder siblings, his brother's living girlfriend, and innumerable cousins. But by far the most colorful members of the family were his parents, Monsieur and Madame. Although they had both been born and raised in Paris, they couldn't be more different. Monsieur was taciturn, withdrawn, and mercilessly henpecked. But with Monsieur it was a case of still waters running deep, because at that time he was head of the French Secret Service and always jetting off around the world to accompany President Pompidou on state visits. And although he never talked about it, I learned that Monsieur had been active in the French resistance. I found it inconceivable that this quiet man had once been proficient in cavalierly slicing the jugular of the occasional Nazi soldier. Madame, by contrast, was a clucking mother hen, large and loud, boisterous and outgoing. Unlike her husband, Madame relished recounting tales of those dark days of the Nazi occupation when she and Monsieur were newlyweds with a young daughter. Often, because of rationing, there was no food in Paris, and Madame was forced to take her dilapidated bicycle out into the countryside, using her charm and guile to get past the Nazi guards at the city gates, in hopes of finding some sympathetic farmer with whom she could barter an invaluable family heirloom for a few eggs or a cut of meat, or if she were very lucky, a stick of butter. And then on her way back into Paris, as she would lustily recount, Madame would bury the contraband deep into her still very ample bosom. I can't tell you how many times when I would see her parade about in a shameless décolleté, I would stare at that cavernous cleavage and think that once upon a time that had been the family larder. Several years later, I lucked into an internship with a French bank. I wrote Olivier that I would be spending the summer in Paris, and he answered with a very gracious invitation from Madame to stay in one of their spare bedrooms. My favorite times that summer were the Sunday dinners, which would begin at 1 in the afternoon and often last into the early evening. These were the only times when the entire extended family would gather, and they were elaborate affairs lubricated with round after round of aperitifs and bottles of fine wine, and punctuated by impassioned political discussion and scatological Gallic humor. In early July, I learned that the sister of a friend and her best friend would be visiting Paris. I told Madame, and she asked that I invite them to Sunday dinner. And what a grand occasion it was. My 2 compatriots spoke very little French, and no one in the family spoke better than broken English, so in all my crowning glory, I was anointed the official DT, the designated translator. Once we'd finished the cheese, Madame got up to clear the table, and I volunteered to help her with the tray. She piled the plates in little leaning towers surrounded by the glasses and crowned with the bread basket and the butter plate. It was late in the afternoon, and the butter had begun to decompose. On my way to the kitchen, my feet got tripped up in the runner rug, and the tray went flying and all came crashing down. I was horrified at my gaffe and apologized effusively to Madame. She merely shook her head and with something of a tusk look pointed silently to the broom closet. I began sweeping up the debris and bent down with the dustpan. I saw that the butter had fallen face flat and now resembled a dirty, angry porcupine, studded with deeply embedded and dangerously protruding shards of glass and covered with an ugly film of hairy dust balls. So I did what any American would have done. I threw the butter away. At that moment, Monsieur came around the corner to inspect the ruckus. When he saw me discarding the butter, he literally froze. His face turned fiery red, and angry veins began bulging from his forehead. What I thought had been an extinct volcano began spewing red-hot lava of the most anatomically precise insults. I didn't understand all his terminology, but I got the gist, comparing me to a befouled sphincter. He elaborated that I was clearly brain dead and the degenerate product of a cushioned youth. Now I pieced together that Monsieur wasn't blaming me for breaking the dishes, that he recognized had been an accident, and accidents are unintended. No, his wrath was because I'd had the insouciance to discard a manifestly redeemable stick of butter. Meanwhile, back in the dining room, the buzz of conversation had gone stone silent as everyone listened breathlessly to Monsieur's cascade of insults. I was overcome with mortification. And I realized for the first time that this otherwise demure man could well indeed, with nary a by your leave, have sliced the necks of an entire brigade of Nazi soldiers. That night in my bedroom, I stared wistfully at the ceiling, wondering what I had done to arouse such wrath. I slowly realized that Monsieur, despite his laconic demeanor, had never gotten over the horrors and deprivations of the war. He had probably had comrades who had been caught smuggling something as innocuous as butter and been summarily executed for their crimes. And in wartime Paris, a stick of butter might have made all the difference between months of insipid meals and finally something sensual and fulfilling. For Monsieur, butter was not just a condiment, it was sustenance itself. But how was I, a baby boomer born into the richest country on earth, to know or even suspect that? I couldn't be blamed if I didn't ascribe a symbolic value to an otherwise unexceptional commodity. Nevertheless, that night, as I turned over and over those withering insults, I realized that I'd been given a privileged glimpse, a momentary insight into the horrors and suffering and shortcomings of life in an occupied city. It took the unbridled wrath of this valiant war veteran for me to realize, in fact, how lucky and blessed my own life had been. Thank you.